All right. Hello, everyone. Let me make sure we get slides visible. But while that is going, quick poll. Who considers themselves putting the dev in DevOps? You identify more as a developer. Okay, we got a few. Thanks for coming out. Who considers themselves putting the ops in DevOps? My people. Okay, and who says, don't make me choose? I'm in between. I live in both worlds. Product people, marketing. All right, well, the title of this talk is Observability Concepts Every Developer Should Know. So why would I come to a DevOps conference to teach ops people who ostensibly already know about observability? Why kind of go through the basics? And well, you're gonna help me out. Thanks. So the reason is because we in ops, through hard-won lessons, through that wall that we had to crumble, have learned the hard way how to monitor, how to observe the intricacies of cardinality explosions with metrics. And when we put developers on call, from my opinion, it kind of feels like we chucked the pagers at them, ran away, and didn't really give them that knowledge transfer. Some of which it just has to be kind of on-the-job experiential learning, but I do think we have a duty and a responsibility to share what we've learned with these developers who are now on call. Yeah, we can make it full screen. We can put on a different window. Thanks for bearing with me, everybody. All right, great. So a quick note, should, awful word, right? It's usually used for things that are chores or impossible standards. You should go to bed on time so that you can wake up refreshed in the morning. You should never be paged by an inactionable alert. It happens. So should, in this context, represents the gulf between where you think you should be, where you are today, and where you think you should be. And so this talk isn't about Observability 101 for developers or operators. It's about how we can help bring developers onto this learning journey. And think about, there's a few different types of engineers that you'll meet in the wild on the job. You've got a new grad. Those are folks who are typically super excited to learn and have basically been exposed to logs. Hello world, what is it if not writing your first log line, right? Metrics, on the other hand, we're kind of inundated with statistics and graphs all the time, and so metrics are where I see new grads that think they know what's going on, but there are so many ways to trip up with PromQL. But you've got kind of an excited learner. That's kind of one class of folks that you've got. You've got senior developers. Maybe they've been at a few different companies. They've seen some things. They've been helming an incident. And they've got some opinions pretty loosely held. But they're cautious and skeptical of new ideas, as one should be. And finally, you've got a staff engineer who's probably suffered through many multiple monitoring migrations. They've seen things fail, they've seen things break, they really care if it's push versus pull, and you've got all of these different types of engineers working on the same system together with you. So how can we kind of address everybody's knowledge gaps here? And I think this post from Reddit really exemplifies this. We've got a developer who's so ready to learn. They came to this forum looking for help. They said, here's what I know. We're running Prometheus, we've got microservices, we've got all of this data, but I feel like I'm missing what matters. Because to me, this really speaks to the situation many of us find ourselves in, kind of drowning with data, dashboards, alerts that are mistuned. What's supposed to be important? Why are we even doing this, right? And he says, does anyone know of a good course or book along these lines? This is great. You want the developers to be asking you. And so, kind of pretty straightforward answer, check out videos from OllyFest, OllyCon, Monitorama, ObservabilityCon. Read these books about BPF. I always want to say the E now. Check out the OTel book, read the SLO book, go forth, right? To me, this is a great answer. And then the OP said, I feel like I need a course just to even understand what you're telling me to do. I came with an open mind seeking advice, and now I've lost. And I think that happens with observability. We've got a lot of inside baseball terms. If you've been in this space a while, it can all kind of start to sound the same when you're explaining this stuff to folks. And so I really I kind of laughed and I cried when I read that post because I said, man, for people who are seeking this knowledge, we're really kind of doing them a disservice by having them walk into this very complex landscape. So if I had to boil it down, what are the contributing factors to observability knowledge gaps? Well, the first thing that I think complicates things for people is tool sprawl. There's always observability, state of observability in XYZ year reports, and year over year they report organizations using 5+ observability tools. Not only that, each of these tools, until we've had some nice open standards with Prom and OTel, each of these tools live in their own ecosystem with their own instrumentation libraries, their own bespoke query languages. It's kind of ridiculous to expect any one engineer to be an expert in everything. So you could have someone who really knows their stuff in one tool who gets totally lost in another. So I think tool sprawl is a really big contributor to the confusion around actually doing things with observability data. Another part is hidden processing. Now, for us who have been running logging pipelines where we're scrubbing PII, where you've been configuring cluster agents to add metadata about what node and pod and cron job is running, we know the journey that happens after a little piece of telemetry is emitted from an app or infrastructure component. But if you don't know, it kind of becomes a huge mystery. Where did this log line, where did this field go that I just added? Why do my logs locally look super different than what is in the tooling? So kind of the hidden processing is a little bit of a barrier to understanding. Another one, I think that developer onboarding is probably one of the most crucial things that you could do and is probably the most underinvested in kind of just across the board. And this isn't as easy as saying, oh, just throw some vendor workshops at them. Your vendor workshops and even your open source tooling is gonna try and say, use all of these things, look at this feature. And your company onboarding may just be too high level. Here's the space we're in, here's our executive team. You kind of need to be that glue between here's the tools we use and here's how we actually use them. No, we don't use Rum, we use this, XYZ. You've got to kind of put that context together for folks. And finally, somewhat related to hidden processing is auto magic. I am not going to say I dislike auto instrumentation. I think it's a very great foundation and springboard. But the problem that I see folks run into is they kind of stop at flipping on an auto instrumentation agent and calling it a day. There's a lot of stuff you've got to do to actually make that data useful for you and your business and your domain, even if it's just as simple as adding a couple tags or fields or even what team owns this service. No auto instrumentation library is going to know that for you. So these kind of things all kind of come together no matter if you're a staff or you're a new engineer. There's lots of different places that you could get confused about how to actually manage and understand observability data at your company. I'm like, why does this matter? Why should we care if developers don't know about observability concepts? Well, we're all working on the same system for one. And for two, a little bit of empathy goes a very long way because none of us were born knowing this stuff. You weren't a baby dreaming up PromQL queries. I know you weren't. And so we have to remember what it is like to be in their shoes and to be dealing and contending with all of this complexity. The other piece is like we are all working on the same system. I think a lot about when I used to run the CI/CD system for a couple companies, and you would have developers kind of come to me in the Slack help channel, and they would say, the pipelines are so slow, you know, what is going on? It's got to be the infrastructure. I'm like, where's the data? Show me a graph, show me something, right? And it totally could be, maybe I didn't configure auto-scaling to happen quick enough, and the containers weren't ready to run the pipelines. Or it could be someone on their team added a bunch of tests to run on their pipeline. It's their pipeline running on my infrastructure, but the line of how you're figuring out, is it you or is it me, should be coming with data together. And if you are the only one that knows how to navigate and understand traces, metrics, events, and all of that stuff, you do a lot of investigations for other people's stuff, and you can start to feel like you're kind of everybody's Ask Jeeves, and we really want to be sharing this responsibility. So when I originally wrote out, you know, what do I think developers need to know? What is the essentials of observability? I came up with a very long multi-page manifesto, and I said, oh my God, I have a lot of opinions, probably too many. What is absolutely critical? How could I boil this down? What I came up with are these three things. You've got to know your data. At a fundamental level, you've got to understand the different types of telemetry that is available. You've got to understand the journey that your telemetry takes from source to storage, because there's a lot of stuff that actually happens along the way that could be hidden that I think folks should be aware of. And then finally, so you understand the data, you know where it's going, how it's getting there. What are you doing with it? If you're being shown a sea of dashboards, wall of charts, how are you actually interpreting to find information from that data? So 3 key concepts, which brings us to understanding telemetry types. And you can think it's as simple as logs, metrics, traces, and events. I put them up from least controversial to most controversial. Like I said, logs have been around the longest. We typically kind of know how to handle those, what's going on. I think metrics come with a lot of sharp edges. Traces are the new kid on the block, but to be honest, they've been here for like 13, 14 years, so I do feel like they should kind of graduate. And then events, which I will have a little bit of a editorializing on. So why does it matter? Well, these data types, one, power our monitors. They power the things that let you know your system's okay and healthy. And like I said, you don't want to be in a tug of war with your developers, always pointing fingers. It would be great to say, here's the data that I'm using to make this judgment or decision. So what I'll say about events, and this is a personal opinion, everything else is going to be pretty widely accepted by the industry. This is a Paige personal opinion. I see events, as a lot of observability vendors do, as a thing that happened, a point-in-time thing that happened that I, a human, would care about, overlaid on a metric chart that I could correlate. What does that mean? Well, it means I want to know my alert fires. Was there just a deployment like 5 minutes before that alert went off? Super handy to have that overlaid on a metric chart. I care about when alerts go on and off, or they go into warning mode. I kind of like to catch when alerts are flappy and fix them. I probably should care whether a feature flag got flipped on or off. That could be indicative of a change that I would care about. Or something like an infrastructure update, a scaling event, whatever. Again, this is a personal opinion, but this is what you see when you go to lots of different tools that emit events, even Kubernetes. It's sort of a thing that happened that you care about. Metrics. Oh, metrics. There's a lot to say on metrics. What I boil it down to is where people get stuck with the gotchas. A lot of metrics processing that happens as far as rolling things up, kind of pre-aggregating, doing recording rules where you're going to pre-compute frequently asked queries or expensive queries. And deriving metrics, I think, is something that is worth spending time on. So is this a native metric? That probably matters. Is it a metric derived from a trace, a span, a log, an event? All of those things would matter if you were using this metric to monitor or alert on something. You kind of need to know where it's coming from, the accuracy of it, and how much you can trust it. So a metric is not just a metric. There's a lot under the hood. And finally, traces. I think where people get tripped up is not how does a span become a trace, but it's the sampling strategy. If you have to sample at the head or the tail, you should understand how that affects the resulting trace data set, because when you look at trace data in aggregate, you need to know kind of your confidence interval on this. You're not going to be saving 100% of traces, so you should keep that in mind, and developers should keep that in mind when they're looking at these trace visualizations. I say this because at SRECon, I got a lot of questions about if can I use a trace to measure the SLI of my P99 latency on this API endpoint? And I'm like, you could, or how much fidelity do you need? How much accuracy do you need in that alert? You probably should just use a native metric, because how is your sampling affecting everything? Also, if you're looking at the long tail, you could have a request that takes a lot longer than your trace assembly window, and you're just like totally missing that data, right? So like there's a lot under the hood with traces as well, knowing how they age out, etc. And then logs. There's stuff you should know about logs. What's your company's indexing strategy? What is going on with your time zone alignment? Are they structured, not structured? Because logs kind of tend to be a last resort, and I have worked in a lot of orgs where some teams have beautiful structured logs, and then you do one hop over to an upstream and you're like, oh my God, what am I looking at? I can't even query over this unstructured mess. And so having the basics of nice logs, being nice to everybody, playing in the commons well, is important. So you all know this stuff. So what are ways and strategies that you can teach your developers a little bit about the ins and outs of these data types? It is not always fun just pointing people to documentation. I promise they don't read it, even if it's funny and has gifs. So the strategies that I've seen work are cookbooks, really short snippets. Here is how you add a tag to a span on an auto-instrumented service. You've got to set the provider up, you've got to do this, and here's just a little snippet. It's not a whole thing, but bonus points if you link it to the actual source code examples in your repo. People will do so much if you just give them a little bit of a first draft to get going with. The OTel documentation site, at least for Python, does this very, very well if you need an example to work with. Another thing that I see, again, people do not like reading. I don't get it. Docs are my best friend. That's where I go first. But a lot of people need to see your end-to-end process. So if you can record a video or a blog kind of stepping through, well, I had this as a metric off of a trace, but we found it wasn't as accurate. So here's how I went through and made it a native metric. And here's how it shows up differently in the tool or whatever. Just showing your process will also go a long way. It's the next best thing to actually pairing in person. And finally, you could make it fun. You could have a quiz, maybe a question of the day. What would be the best way to measure latency on an endpoint? Some people will say averages. Don't roll your eyes. We all had to start there. And so making a fun, small learning, little tidbits can kind of help you build up that shared understanding with your teammates, and then they will come to you with even better questions than how do I set up auto-scaling on my service or whatever. So to bring it down to earth, when would you want to say, we should invest in some learning here? Well, like many people, maybe your observability bill is super high and your ops team is on it to get it fixed ASAP. You can do the analysis to identify what services are the top contributors, but then who does the cleanup, right? They're not your logs, they're the application developer's application logs. Most of the time, the person who has to do the work, especially in an emergency kind of fixed situation like this, is the one who knows it best, who can get it done the quickest, which means it's ops, always. So if you can get ahead of this and you've got a developer base that does understand, oh, here's how I would trim the logs, or we don't need this as a log, it could be a metric or whatever, that enables you to do the work that you care about, and it really helps them own their service. What is you build it, you own it if you're not owning the whole telemetry lifecycle? I don't know, but I would like to see more people talk about that. Okay, second point, following the telemetry journey from source to storage. It is not 3 hops like this. As we all know, there are probably fleets of collectors. There's a load balancer. Your logging pipeline with Fluent Bit is set up somewhere. There's a lot going on. There may be cluster agents that are adding metadata hidden to the developers. You may have this mapped out. You may not even have this mapped out for every signal in your organization. But on the whole, it goes through these stages. The generate step, the developers should be familiar with, except if you've just auto-instrumented everything and there's no prior art for how to manually add something or programmatically add something. But generally, if you could create this list or this map for your org, here's the blessed libraries we use. Oh, we instrument and we use it with environment variables. Please never do it config as code or whatever. Adapt it to your org and say, here's how we support generating telemetry. Here's how we collect it. Are your collectors just pass-through proxies? Are your collectors actually doing some work of transformation? Are you using open source off-the-shelf components or using vendor resources? This is where a lot of folks get confused, because if they do try to go to the docs, the vendors say, oh, you must be using our collector. Of course you would. Here's how you set it up. It's so easy. And you're like, well, no, I wasn't using that. Now what? Now what? So you want to be there to answer that developers now what. Exporting, sometimes I worked at one org where the infra logs were too expensive to send to the vendor, so all the infra logs lived in a different tool than the app logs. It was horrible. I had 2 screens up when I was ever trying to correlate something. So it's important to know where your data is going. I did not discover that the logs were in different places until it was the middle of an incident, which was not the best time to find out. So mapping this out ahead of time is great. And finally, when it comes to storage, the part that you should be educating folks on is really the downsampling strategy, or what is happening to that data over time. Because unless you work for like a really rich company, most of us have to do some aggregations or downsampling, or we're not keeping our metrics at full fidelity for like 5 years. And I started out my career at New Relic, and I thought it was really cool. I would pull up my APM chart, and I was like, oh my God, you could go back, a year, 2 years. And then somebody told me, hey, the one data point you see when it's a time window of 10 minutes is a really small bucket, really accurate data. When you're zooming out to 2 years, say, that one data point that you see on the screen is actually representing like a day, 2 days, a week. That's not super useful, and that's really good to know, and it's not something that's always talked about. So when you think about this journey for your telemetry and your organization, think about the places where you should call out, this is how we're doing it differently. These are the transformations that are happening. We always give you the pod name. We source the team owner from the code owner's file in GitHub. Show people where all of this data is coming from. Demystify it. You don't want people to say, oh, it's just a magical black box. So how do you go about doing this? You can have an observability knowledge check, basically drawing out, where do you think the logs go? How many tools do you think we have? Is a very fun question to ask your organization. You will get many answers. And you may even learn about tools you didn't even know existed running in your org. Again, a simple flow chart. It doesn't have to be, here's how we're doing our sharding strategy for sending spans to the same collector. Keep it high level. It goes from here to here to here, and let people double click in when they need to. And then finally, if you want to really bring it home for folks, you could walk through an investigation of how you identify broken traces and how you fix them. That's a very interesting and fun way to learn about how spans become a trace that isn't so dry and sort of reading the docs. So I think I'd mentioned this before, like this has happened to me on the job where developers said, hey, I'm trying to work on my instrumentation. Yay, you want to hear that. You want to encourage that. Better instrumentation, better insights. But they're like, where the heck are my fields going? And that is such a frustrating situation to be in because you can run it locally. I see the fields. I deploy it. Where did the fields go? And I learned we had some post-processing that was even hidden to me inside an admin panel, inside our observability tool, that had a bunch of stuff. It was basically only whitelisting the fields that we agreed to because we didn't want our bill to be super high. They learned something, and I learned something along the way. And this just highlights, we don't want there to be magic. Just tell people what's happening to their data. If we want them to own it, they've kind of got to have all these pieces. And finally, deciphering visualizations. We are, as a society, just inundated with, oh, this scientific study says coffee's bad. Nope, actually 90% of people say coffee's great. Like, there's a lot of ways to lie with statistics, both visually and with queries. I think I'd mentioned before, a lot of us in this room would know why we shouldn't use averages, but not everybody has had that enlightenment yet. So think about the things that matter to measure for your organization and really find ways to do like a, what's wrong with this query? Or why doesn't this alert work? Kind of give people little examples to work with and gnaw on, because really people are not going to pick up a statistics book as much as I would like them to. So something that is fun that you can do is, throw up a chart. If you saw this chart out of the blue, like right now, what questions do you have? You should have questions about this. I thought, well, one, what's my time window? I'm always like, what is the time window of what I'm looking at? And two, what is the y-axis representing? Why is there no tag, showing me what's going on there? Where's the legend, and what's happening, and what's this little note with the bar? Oh, so what this is the Google Trend result for OpenTelemetry over the last 5 years. The y-axis represents the search interest relative to the most popular point on the time period in the graph, which I'm still kind of wrapping my head around, but basically 100 is this search term is the most popular it's ever been, 50 is like it's half as much. That note is when they like beefed up their analytics and either got more data in or could handle more. And now you're like, okay, I've got my bearings. What is that dip by March? What is going, that's where my mind goes. Like, what is that weird dip? So I hovered over it. I said, what's going on here? That represents December 25th to 31st, 2022 of the United States, which is when we all take holidays. And thank God people are not Googling open telemetry, but they're spending time with their family and friends, right? That dip looks very significant because we're in that zone where OTel was the most popular it's ever been. So 1 week of a bunch of people not searching it had a way bigger kind of impact than a bunch of people not searching it even 2 or 3 years ago at that Christmas time. That's interesting, right? Like, you can find all sorts of stuff if you just throw up a chart and tell people, what info do you get from this? What conclusions are you drawing? 3 people could have 10 different conclusions about looking at the same chart. This is something that's best kind of done together and collaboratively. So how can you do this? Take notes from New York Times, what's going on in this graph? Kind of does what it says on the tin. They give you a graph, they ask what's going on, they close it after a week, and then they kind of walk you through the statistics and what's going on. This would be super fun to do like once a week in Slack, I think. You could get a lot of people learning in a fun and engaging way. I like to have people go on what's called a production scavenger hunt. So I say, what region, or are we getting more calls from mobile versus our web clients? Or what service takes the longest to respond? Like, just fun things to get people querying and spark their curiosity. You can do this in a more formal setting. I've got my SREcon talk linked here on cognitive apprenticeship. As a fancy term, it really was paired investigation. Think paired programming, but instead we'll take an alert that's flapping. Selfishly, it was a way for me to attempt to address alert fatigue. That did not work out for that, but did work out to teach people how to use observability data, how to better assess their alerts. We went from people totally trusting the alerts to saying, let me open up this alert query. Is this even doing what I think it's doing? Or is this like a red herring or false positive? So you can watch that talk to kind of get the nuts and bolts on how to run that type of meeting yourself. But I think what we learned, not only did staff engineers learn or new engineers, but people would walk away and say, I did not know the system worked like that. And, oh my God, we should have deleted this alert like 3 months ago. That always made me happy. And finally, if the in-person interaction or the time zones don't work out, my company right now, Chronosphere, has a channel called Prom Queens. And that is open for anybody to come bring a gnarly PromQL question, and you'll get a bunch of nerds to hack on it and explain why the original query wasn't working, how to fix it, and everybody's learning. So find ways to use your data in your system to bring people together specifically for the purpose of we're just going to figure this out together. We're not going to assume you already know this stuff. And it's not the heat of an incident, so like the temperature is kind of down in the room. Where I see this coming up the most is developers keep blaming issues on the network, and you owning the infrastructure, your team starts catching heat. And whether or not it is the network, if enough developers complain about it, that sort of becomes the vibe, and your team can sort of be seen as unreliable or whatever if you don't got those like nice SLOs in place. So I've also seen this with the pipelines, but how do you move forward, right? It's not always enough to slap up a chart with nothing else. I would say my least favorite is people coming to me without any data at all. My second least favorite is people just dropping a chart and just walking away. Like, oh, that's why. And you're like, what did you see in that chart? Also, why'd you take a screenshot and not send me the link? I want to go see this chart for myself. I want to look at the query. And so the better we can teach people how to look at and interpret this data, the better either people can say, hey, it is the network, here's why, here's a little, starting place to start your investigation, or, oh my God, actually it was my config issue, and I solved my own problem and saved you, doing that 101 investigation. Like, whether we like it or not, we're working together. We need to work together. And I still believe that we have the duty, the onus is on us to share all of the lessons that we've learned with devs. Because it is the best thing in the world. When you've worked with a dev, you've done the pairing, you've said, let's add a custom metric together. Let me help you set up a local instrumentation environment with the agent sending to, with a tag, local dev environment Marcus, or whatever it is. And then you see the metrics show up, and they're like, oh my God, we release once a week. This saved me like 2 weeks of work. And it's like beautiful, and then they come to you the next time with like a way better question that's more fun than how do you add a custom metric. Like, you gotta start small. But moving forward, using data is the best way to avoid some of the bickering and the blaming that can happen, because you really should not be arguing with the data. Okay, now what? You're like, Paige, I already knew about metrics, events, logs, and traces. We're calling it melts. I already knew that we do some hidden stuff and we're scrubbing PII. And I kind of already knew, if I look at a chart, I can be like, rate limit, timeout. You've developed that spidey sense. So now you've got to look at the problems in your org, or where you think the tricky spots are, or most organizations are going through a massive tool consolidation. That means you're going to have developers who had a tool that they loved, that they were experts in, that are now forced to use a tool they are not a fan of, and you're going to have some resistance learners. Or you've got to trim the bill, and you need to figure out not only just hacking logs and metrics away, you want to do it in a smart way. You don't want what that original poster said, which is, I don't want to miss anything. What are we doing this for if not to understand our systems better? So I will leave you with this quote from Slavic and effective monitoring and alerting. You've got to accept the reality. The system as perceived is not the system as found. And when you bring developers in on this learning journey, and you kind of show them the ropes, here's how you figure stuff out, here's why you got to add a rate to a counter when you're looking over a time window, they will have better insights about the system, and you will have way more fun questions coming to you in the Slack channel. You can even do something as simple as a quick observability knowledge check. This could be for new folks coming in to kind of highlight parts of the org that you need to show them around, where are all the places you can send data. What's the retention period for logs or metrics? What tags or labels are added automatically? When and where are metric aggregations applied? How do we sample? Add a main point. Good stuff. So for you, resources, because I'm going to guess most of us don't have a background in curriculum or higher education or adult learning, there's a very good set of books here. Better Onboarding, Design for How People Learn, fantastic. Software Telemetry, that is all about, it cannot be technology agnostic, but they did use all open source observability tooling, so I feel great recommending that one, but it's really about the conceptual level of how telemetry gets from one place to another, and all the options and knobs and fiddles and things that you've got available to you. I am Paige Cruz. You can find me pretty much everywhere at PagerDuty with an I. If you want to send a version of this to developers, the version for devs is written in a blog post that kind of walks through a little bit more each of those examples. My team builds open source observability tutorials, all open source. Though I work for an observability vendor, my work is all with the open source community. Monitorama is coming up, just have to do a quick plug, come visit me in Portland. And if you were curious about the questions I ask in the production scavenger hunt, I've also linked that. All right, credits. And if we have time for questions, I'm very happy to take them. If not, I'm also happy to get to lunch. Thank you.